serial killers are not a uniquely American phenomenon, it's undeniable that such malevolent criminal behavior has captured the national psyche, with some of the most celebrated pieces of American cinema detailing the exploits of both fictional and non-fictional serial killers. The vast majority of America's most famous serial killers seem to have operated in what we might call the golden age of serial murder, which include the crimes of Bundy, Gacy, and Dahmer, spanning from the early 70s to the late 1980s. Yet very little light is shed onto the history of American serial killers, and it often begs the question, who were the first serial killers to operate in the United States? To answer that question, we have to go all the way back to the fledgling 13 colonies, to a time when violence and political strife were a part of people's daily lives, and the War of Independence set the continent aflame. This is the story of America's first brutal and bloodthirsty serial killers, the Harvey Brothers. Little is known about the early years of Micah and Wiley Harp, but they are thought to have been born in 1748 and 1750 respectively. They were the sons of Scottish parents who had emigrated from their native land in either 1759 or 1760. And although it's been speculated that the Harp brothers were actually first cousins, we can know for certain that they settled in Orange County, North Carolina between 1761 and 1763. Like many of the Scottish settlers in the 13 colonies, the Harp family were staunch Calvinist Protestants, meaning that they were fiercely loyal to the King of England. Nicknamed Tories, such people often joined regulatory militias which put down rebellions among those who resented royal interference. Ironically, at the advent of the Revolutionary War, the Harp brothers attempted to enlist with patriotic American forces rebelling against the crown. But due to their family's past associations with Tory militias, they were refused entry to the militias on suspicion of being spies. Some historians have speculated that this led to feelings of resentment and persecution among the brothers, but it's much more likely that they were indeed hoping to work as spies, as they soon began butchering revolutionary sympathizers with a frightening level of zeal. It's believed that the Harp brothers were residing in North Carolina during this period of hostilities, and that following their rejection from the revolutionary militia, they joined a group of predatory loyalist criminals who took advantage of wartime lawlessness by violating women, stealing, murdering, and burning and destroying property, especially the farms of patriot colonists. And these gangs were exactly as brutal and obscenely violent as you can imagine. However, the crude epithet was intended as an insult by the revolutionaries, and officially speaking, the Harp brothers' gang were called military associators, men who fought for the crown, taking only what they could loot and steal as payment. As the war against the colonists grew more desperate, the Harp brothers and their gang took part in the Battle of Kings Mountain in October of 1780, as well as the Battle of Blackstocks in November of 1780. Yet their efforts did nothing to slow the progress of the revolution, and following the decisive British defeat by Patriot and French forces at Yorktown in 1781, the Harp brothers fled North Carolina to seek refuge with the renegade Chickamauga Cherokee tribe in the Appalachian Mountains. From their mountain sanctuary, the Harps began a series of revenge raids against the newly liberated Americans of the United States, the first of which was a devastating attack while in the company of 400 Chickamauga tribesmen on present-day Nashville, Tennessee. The following year, the Harps helped give Daniel Boone's frontier army a bloody nose at the Battle of Blue Licks in Kentucky, all before retreating to the Native American village of Nickajack. However, it wasn't long before Boone and his forces closed in on the village, and as payback for the defeat at Blue Licks, they put Nickajack to the torch. Given that they were still considered traitors to the revolutionary cause, the Harp brothers were forced to hide out in the forests of Powell Valley near Knoxville, stealing supplies from local pioneers in order to survive. During this period, the brothers stewed in bitterness, having been almost completely outcast from civilized society. They hated the fact that they lost their way. They hated the neighboring townsfolk. They hated the very country they resided in. And so, instead of simply giving up the ghost and facing up to their treacherous past, the Harps embarked on one of the first campaigns of serial murder in American history. In 1797, they were believed to have murdered a man named Johnson for no other reason than they happened across him while out hunting one day. After killing him, the Harps then cut open the man's chest, tore out his internal organs, filled the cavity with rocks and stones, then urinated all over him. Following the discovery of the man's corpse, a huge effort was made to find the culprits, forcing the Harps to flee north into neighboring Kentucky. They entered the state of the Wilderness Road near a place known as Cumberland Gap, and on their travels they came across a traveling salesman named Peyton. Peyton offered to sell the Harps some of his goods, but upon hearing him talk in glowing tones of the newly founded republic, Micah Harp flew into a rage and beat the man to death. The brothers then repeated the act of disemboweling and urinating on the body of their victim, then made off with the dead man's horse and some of his goods. Next, the brothers targeted 2 travelers from Maryland, torturing, murdering, and mutilating the pair when they were overheard expressing animosity towards the British. It's believed that the younger of the 2 Harp brothers, Wiley, held one of the travelers down and forced them to watch the torture and murder of their longtime companion. And once again, both of the victims' chest cavities were filled with stones and rocks as a final show of gruesome disrespect. Then, following the Harps' murder of a Virginia man named John Langford, the pair were apprehended by a local militia force before being imprisoned at the Kentucky State Prison in Danville. Yet after luring one of their guards into the cell on the pretense of being horribly unwell, the Harps strangled him with their own shackles, took his key, then escaped into the surrounding wilderness by a local militia. Once the alarm was raised, a posse of jailers and militiamen were sent after them. Somehow, the Harps found out the identities of the men who'd formed the posse, and as revenge, snuck into a nearby town in the dead of night, hunted down one of the men's family, and then slaughtered his young son. Following such a horrific atrocity, Kentucky Governor James Garrard announced a $300 bounty on the Harps on April 22nd of 1799. Garrard had hoped the bounty would pacify the brothers, either driving them out of state or forcing them to lay low. Instead, it only succeeded in making them more vicious. The brothers became intensely paranoid, often mistaking innocent travelers for pursuing bounty hunters, and over the days that followed, the Harps killed 5 different people in 2 separate instances, simply because they had been spotted and feared being further pursued. After fleeing into the state of Illinois, the brothers made their way to a natural cave system on the bluffs above the Ohio River, only to discover it was the stronghold of a band of river pirates led by the infamous Samuel Mason. Mason welcomed a pair of fellow outlaws into his midst, especially when they asked only to be sheltered from the law, and would aid the gang in their raids while only asking for food, water, and a place to sleep in return. Mason believed the brothers would be something of a boon to the gang, but he soon realized that they were nothing but a burden, and a shockingly evil one at that. Generally speaking, the Mason gang killed only when they needed to, and only ever for monetary gain. But in the case of the Harp brothers, they seemed to mutilate and kill just for the fun of it. At one point, the brothers led away one of the gang's hostages, with Mason believing that they were leading the man back to their hideout to be kept prisoner. Moments later, the gang watched in horror as the Harps appeared on a cliff above them, before shoving their now naked prisoner down onto rocks below, laughing as he screamed for mercy. Their lust for blood and terror was so insatiable that in the end, even a hardened outlaw like Samuel Mason had to force the brothers to leave at gunpoint.
Step 2.
They wanted no part of the sick depravity that the brothers partook in, bloodshed that would surely only draw the law's attention. The Harp brothers were furious at the rejection, but there was no arguing with the business end of a rifle. So instead of seeking further conflict, the brothers simply moved back into eastern Tennessee to carry on their killing spree. In July of 1798, records show that a farmer named Bradbury, a man named Hardin, and a boy named Coffee were all murdered by the Harp brothers, although no such record indicates exactly why they were killed, as there were no witnesses. We can speculate that the farmer was killed so that the men could help themselves to his crops without having their movements reported to the authorities. But why on earth the brothers would want to kill a young boy is simply beyond all reasonable explanation, and provides nothing but an insight into how murderously depraved they truly were. The brothers left a trail of death wherever they went, and as a result, they became remarkably easy to track. Authorities were able to trace them to the banks of the Holston River, where a man named William Ballard was found disemboweled, packed with rocks, then tossed into the waters so the fish could gnaw on his rotting flesh. They were then traced to a place known as Brassel's Knob, where the body of a man named James was discovered with his home ransacked and his throat slashed. To evade authorities, it seems the brothers then crossed state lines into south central Kentucky, where the discovery of two bodies seemed to bear all the hallmarks of their grisly handiwork. John Graves and his teenage son was found dead near Logan County, with extensive mutilation to each of their skulls, most probably having been caused by the axes they were using to chop wood. And like so many others, they had been disemboweled, packed with rocks and stones, then urinated on. It seems just a few nights later the brothers came across an entire family sleeping in a camp not far off the trail from where they were walking down. If we're to believe that their signature was disembowelment, this family of 5 also fell victim to their bloodlust, and once again, they needlessly slaughtered an innocent child who would have posed absolutely no threat to them whatsoever. This is one of the few crimes that the Harps ever expressed any real remorse over, with Wiley Harp confessing that he'd bashed in the infant girl's head against a tree because her wails of terror irritated him. The brothers' killing spree continued all throughout the summer of 1799, but the more lives they stole, the bigger the pursuing posse grew. It swelled with the family members of those they'd slaughtered, men who sought to wreak a terrible revenge on the 2 monsters who'd taken away their loved ones. By the end of the summer, the posse was said to number almost 100 men, who were then able to split up into mounted, fast-moving teams of hunters, who eventually succeeded in tracking and cornering the brothers in Kentucky's Muhlenberg County. The brothers were preparing to ambush a settler named George Smith when suddenly, a voice called out through the woods ordering them to surrender. Terrified, the brother attempted to flee, but a member of the posse fired a well-aimed shot which struck Micajah Harp in the leg. Wiley Harp managed to quickly mount his horse before escaping the posse, but the same could not be said for the wounded Micajah. And as he lay bleeding among the pines, the posse forced him to confess to up to 20 different murders.
Sure you can
When he was finished, a man named Moses Stegall, the grieving relative of a family the brothers had killed, stepped forward and produced a large Bowie knife from his belt. Then, while Micajah was still conscious, Moses plunged the knife into Micajah's throat, slicing and cutting until he was able to twist the outlaw's blood-soaked head from the stump of his neck. Moses then placed the bloody head in a burlap sack, then rode all the way back to Webster County, Kentucky, where the family's homestead was built, before nailing the head to a tree outside the house. And to this day, the crossroads near which Micajah's head was mounted is known as Harp's Head Road, in honor of the revenge that was reaped that fateful day. Not long after the death of his brother, Wiley Harp managed to talk his way back into the Mason gang, and he managed to evade the same fate as Micajah for 4 long years. But eventually, Wiley's luck ran out, and he was captured along with the rest of the Mason gang when the law finally caught up with him. In 1804, Wiley was executed via hanging in modern-day Jefferson County, Mississippi. And like his brother, Wiley's head was staked high along the Natchez Trace as a warning to other outlaws.
I know what I'm doing.
And so marked the end of the Harp brothers' killing spree, one that had lasted almost 3 decades and claimed the lives of up to 50 innocent men, women, and children. Their terrifying story sank deep into American folklore, and although there are numerous references to them in art and literature throughout the 20th century, theirs is a story that is painfully undertold in our day and age. They are arguably America's first real serial killers, having established a specific modus operandi that made their murders as distinguishable as they were dastardly. And theirs is a story that will remain as compelling as it is chilling. for as long as it's told.
Step 2.
In the late spring of 1986, Virginia Tech Business Administration master's student
Sure you can
Becca
handle
White
me,
sat down
Summoner?
for breakfast one morning in the university's cafeteria. She was a hard-working and diligent young student, but her industriousness had left her isolated and pining for the company of another. As such, we can only imagine her joy when Manhattan-born architecture student Claudia Brenner
Got a good
sidled up next to her and asked her something along the lines of, "Is a seat taken?" What followed was the love affair of a lifetime, as each woman discovered their intimate preferences of their opposite number, and they realized that they were perfect for each other. They had a great deal in common, with both of them being highly intelligent, goal-oriented young women who both had a deep appreciation for the outdoors. Then over the next 2 years, as they fell deeply in love with one another, they made frequent trips to some of the most beautifully scenic hiking trails that the Appalachians had to offer. And so it came to pass that in May of 1988, Claudia and Rebecca decided to visit the Michaud State Forest in Pennsylvania, an 85,000-acre expanse of woodland that is home to a section of the Appalachian Trail. They drove up from Virginia Tech, singing along to the radio the whole way, sharing road snacks and planning out their latest outdoor adventure. Then eventually, they found what they agreed was a suitable place to park their car before gathering up their things and headed off into the trees. But the place they parked had a name that, in light of the fate they shared, has a chilling sense of foreboding to it. Because the place they parked before heading off into the Michaud State Forest was one named Dead Woman's Hollow. About an hour into their walk down the Appalachian Trail, the couple came across the first of a series of campgrounds known as primitive campsites. There are around 7 or 8 of those campsites dotting the southern slopes of the Appalachian Hills, with Rebecca and Claudia navigating the trail until they found the perfect site for them to pitch their tent. Once they established their cozy two-person campsite, Rebecca White excused herself to the campground's bathrooms for a moment. But as she walked, she was suddenly startled by the presence of a young man who seemed to be lurking near the small wooden facilities building. It wasn't just his sudden and unexpected presence that startled her either. It was the young man's frightening appearance that really gave her the creeps. The young man's hair was wild and unkempt, and his shockingly gaunt facial features made it look like he hadn't eaten a decent meal in weeks. His clothes were filthy and torn, and the amount of dirt under the man's fingernails suggested that bathing wasn't exactly his strong suit. The man grinned at Rebecca and asked if she had a spare cigarette. She told him that she didn't smoke, then politely excused herself before walking back towards the campsite. Rebecca immediately told Claudia that they weren't nearly as alone as they first expected, and that the encounter with the leering stranger had her feeling considerably creeped out. Since it was still relatively early in the afternoon, Claudia suggested they pack up and move camps, an idea which Rebecca thoroughly agreed with. So, over the next hour or so, the girls dismantled their tent, packed away their belongings, and then carried on hiking down the trail in the direction of the next primitive campsite. At one point, the couple stopped to check their map to ensure that they were headed in the right direction. They studied the map for a moment, then looked up from it to scan their surroundings when, suddenly, one of them spotted a man lurking in the trail behind them.
I've got a good
It was the same
feeling
man that
about
had
this.
asked Rebecca for a cigarette back at the campground bathrooms. It made for a grim moment of realization for the couple. It wasn't just a chance encounter. They were being followed. Rebecca and Claudia immediately marched off down a trail they
Don't
believed would
get
lead them to the
cocky.
next primitive campground, picking up their pace in the hopes the man might lose track of them. The couple stopped on several other occasions as they progressed, looking over their shoulders to ensure that they weren't continually being followed. Only when they failed to spot the gaunt-looking hermit did they feel safe enough to make camp again, and they did so at the next campground they came across. Once their campground was set up, the couple prepared dinner, growing more comfortable with their surroundings as they ate. The woods around them seemed quiet and still. As the more time went by, the more they became convinced that they were completely alone. It's at this point that Rebecca and Claudia began cuddling, watching the horizon turn from blue to orange as the sun dipped in the sky and began to set. It was rare that they had moments alone, and the couple relished every second of the peace and quiet the deep woods offered. There was just one problem. They were not alone. Creeping up to the campsite on Cat's Paw was the man that had asked Rebecca for a cigarette. He was an accomplished tracker, enough so that he was able to slip away from the couple entirely to retrieve something from the place he called home. You see, the man had a brick and mortar home, but he also spent a great deal of time living in a cave out in the woods. And it was this cave he'd returned to in order to fetch a .22 caliber rifle he kept hidden away inside of it. The man kept the rifle close to his chest, watching the dancing flames of the girl's campfire from around 100 feet away. Then, as Claudia and Rebecca began to get intimate with one another, the man took the opportunity to creep closer and closer, staring intently as the girls began to kiss. Then, right as they were about to retire to their tent for the evening, the man raised his rifle, took aim, and let out 8 shots in their direction. 5 bullets ripped through Claudia Brenner, breaking her arm, tearing apart her face, cracking her skull and puncturing her neck, while the remaining 3 rounds grazed Rebecca White's head, ripping through her back and puncturing her liver. After firing the shots, the man tore off through the woods in the opposite direction, whooping and laughing as he ran. Hunting his fellow humans was one of the most exhilarating thrills of his entire life, and to see his prey collapsing as his bullets tore through them was nothing short of intoxicating for him. The man believed that there was no way that either of the women could survive such a fusillade of gunfire.
Sure you can handle me,
but he was wrong.
Summoner?
Although Rebecca was in critical condition from being shot through the liver, Rebecca found that despite her wounds, she was able to stand. With tears of terror in her eyes, she promised her pale and bloodied girlfriend that she'd go to fetch them help. And then off she went, limping down the trail for 3 whole miles until she finally came to a main road. Claudia managed to flag down a passing driver who rushed her to the nearby Shippensburg police station in order to seek medical attention. Claudia described exactly where the attack had taken place before she was rushed to the hospital. Yet despite arriving at the campgrounds as quickly as she could, the officers found that Rebecca had succumbed to her wounds. While a heartbroken Claudia Brenner received word of her girlfriend's death, the police combed the crime scene for any evidence they could find. They quickly noticed that around 25 unfired .22 caliber bullets were lying on the ground, just less than 100 yards away from the campsite. They also found a knit cap, not from the bullets, and correctly assumed that the item belonged to Rebecca's killer. One group of cops then searched the surrounding trails, while another took note of all the information that Claudia could offer them, including how she strongly suspected the man who'd followed them being the attacker. A considerable effort was made to apprehend the gaunt, hermit-like man that had followed them down the trail. But over the weeks that followed, the police weren't able to locate anyone matching Claudia's detailed description. Meanwhile, a group of Old Order Mennonites who lived within just a few miles of the Michaud State Forest were visited by a man named Stephen Roy Carr, who expressed an interest in their community. Old Order Mennonites are similar to the Amish in the sense that they shun modern technology and refrain from involving themselves in modern society. Some communities even refuse to speak English among themselves and prefer to speak the German or Dutch of their religious ancestors. As you can imagine, the group doesn't exactly have people lining up to join them. So when the solitary visitor told them that he wished to join their community, they welcomed him with only the slightest hint of suspicion. Yet as it turned out, not everyone in this particular Mennonite community followed their faith as strictly as their brethren. And in the attic of one household, there was a secret television that the homeowner would use to watch the nightly news. It was during one of these broadcasts that the Mennonite learned of a brutal murder that had taken place in the nearby Michaud forest. And when a picture of the case's main suspect was shown, the man instantly recognized him as the gaunt-faced stranger that had wandered into their community in the days prior. Under the pretense of needing to purchase some primitive farming equipment, the secret TV watcher headed into a nearby town. Yet the moment he arrived, he rushed to the local sheriff to report that none other than Stephen Roy Carr was sheltering himself among his people. A careful and very delicate operation was then planned, one that would keep this Mennonite's secrets under wraps while also ensuring that Carr would not receive any advance warning of his imminent arrest. It involved the Mennonite returning to his village and inviting Carr to join him for dinner one evening. Then, just as Carr sat down to dinner with a family he believed had nothing but good intentions for him, the local police force swarmed their dwelling, capturing their suspect before putting him in cuffs. Even though the evidence against him was sparse, to say the least, homicide detectives managed to convince Carr to waive his right to a jury trial in exchange for an agreement by the prosecution not to seek the death penalty. Yet at his trial, Carr made the horrifically homophobic claim that he had been so enraged by the sight of two women making love that he had simply lost his mind and opened fire. He also tried to claim that Claudia and Rebecca had known he was watching, and that their love-making was purely a method of taunting and provoking him. His defense attorney tried to link this to the fact that Carr had been violated in a Florida prison, as well as having been abused as a child, and that the display of homosexuality had caused him to go temporarily insane. Thankfully, the judge refused to show any form of leniency against Carr, completely dismissing his claims as being homophobic nonsense and forcing the defense to accept the maximum penalty of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In the aftermath of her ordeal, Claudia Brenner moved to Ithaca, New York, and went on to author a book which detailed the events of the shooting. She had since become an activist against anti-gay violence and is a vocal advocate of harsher sentences for those convicted of hate crimes against the LGBT community. Thankfully, public acceptance of gay and lesbian couples has skyrocketed since the mid-1980s, with local and national hate crime laws extending the sentences of those who seek to harm or persecute people who simply wish to freely express their love for their romantic partners. People like Stephen Carr must never be allowed to receive leniency by claiming that the free expression of love and affection offends or angers them, especially when two people seek the privacy and seclusion of a quiet campground to express that love.
I know what I'm doing.
Your team has destroyed a turret.
I'm a huge camping and hiking enthusiast, so one of the holy grails of my hobby has always been the Appalachian Trail. Unfortunately, I've never had the time to dedicate to hike the whole thing, so throughout the years, me and a few friends of mine visited certain sections of the trail for about a week or so at a time. We were based over in New Jersey, so we crossed Mount Mincy off of our list fairly early. Then the next year, we suffered through the part of the trail near Anthony's Nose that leads up to Camp Smith. The year after that, we conquered the 100-mile wilderness up in Maine. But then in 2018, we decided to venture a little further south. We'd heard a lot of good things about both the George Washington and Jefferson National Parks, how they're some of the wildest sections of the trail, and how the parks are home to some really cool features like the oldest fire lookout tower in the eastern U.S. But the place I had my heart set on visiting was an old ghost town called Lignite. I'm really into ruins and abandoned places and stuff like that, and I think I'd be more into urban exploration if your videos on the subject didn't put me off the idea entirely. See, the idea of getting to see an old ruined town like that was really appealing to me. In reality, though, venturing out near Lignite was probably one of the worst mistakes we'd ever come to make while on a hiking trip. And it's honestly kind of a miracle that none of us were seriously hurt. So to cut to the chase here, we started out near Covington. then hiked our way down into the forest until we hit the trail. After that, we followed it about 20 miles or so, up these winding trails until we found Lignite. The whole hike took us about 9 hours, so as you can imagine, we were pretty exhausted by the time we arrived at the old ghost town.
I've got a good feeling
So instead
about
of
this.
moving off to find more covered campsite for the night, we decided to just bed down near the ruins so we could go exploring them in the morning. And there wasn't all that much to see, to be perfectly honest. Just some of the old foundations and a few crumbling chimney stacks. But it was still worth it to take a few pictures before we moved on down the trail. The next morning, we got up, and before we packed our stuff away, me and my buddy Joey decided to take a little stroll among the ruins. We're just meandering along, still kind of half asleep from the grueling hike of the day before, and Joey's taking the lead while I follow with my
You've
phone,
got
taking
dangerous
pictures.
eyes. I like that.
Then suddenly, my eyes are drawn to something that Joey seems to be walking towards while in blissful ignorance, and I find myself just reaching out to grab the back of his shirt, tugging him back to stop him from walking any further. Right there among the half-dead yellow grass was an old, rusted bear trap. At first, we were kind of amazed as we were looking at it. The thing looked like it could have been an antique, like it had been there for 100 years just rusting away in the wilderness. Joey then tried to make out, jokingly I should add, that I'd basically saved him from nothing, and that he'd have been kind of impressed if the thing had actually clamped itself around his leg if he'd actually stood on it. We made each other a little bet over whether or not it was still functioning, all before picking up a few rocks and bits of old brick to toss at the small round trigger in the middle. It took us a few tries, but in the end, Joey managed to hit the trigger mechanism with a chunk of old masonry, and then snap. We found ourselves recoiling in horror as the thing violently snapped shut. We both shared this nervous kind of laughter because it could have just as easily been Joey's leg trapped in that thing if he'd stood on it. And although we were laughing, we were definitely pretty freaked out. It was only when we realized that there might actually be more of them in the area that we actually got serious about it. As a threat dealt with was one thing, but a threat unknown was another thing entirely. We then very carefully made our way back to where we were camped, told the other guys about the bear trap, then suggested that we move someplace else, and there might have been more of them out there in the grass or something. This guy Mike didn't believe us, thought that we were playing a prank on him, and only realized that we were serious when I showed him the picture on my phone of the bear trap all closed up. After that, we packed up our stuff and very carefully hiked out of the area, making sure to keep our eyes on the ground in front of
Not
us
a
the whole way. We ended up walking around 5 miles west towards a place called Barber's Creek, hoping it would provide us with a much safer campsite, as well as a source of fresh, clean water. It definitely provided us with one of those things, as there were a few fast-flowing parts of the river that allowed us to fill up our water bottles. But although it seemed fine and deserted to us at first, we found something the next morning that proved otherwise. One of our usual routines when deciding on where to camp would be to mark out an area for us to use as a bathroom. I won't gross you out with all the gory details of digging holes and whatnot, but it was the kind of silent agreement to confine all our grumpies, as Johnny Depp so elegantly phrased it, to a certain area away from the campground and remain as hygienic as possible. Then, once the sun had set, we made ourselves some hot food over a fire, shared some bourbon that Mike had brought along,
Double kill.
then got ourselves some much-needed rest. We didn't hear anything moving around in the darkness. We didn't hear any voices or sounds of metal or anything. The whole night was perfectly quiet and still, apart from a few crickets and cicadas. And that's when we found it extra creepy the next morning, when Mike got up and wandered off to the bathroom area and found something that had him calling out to us through the trees. I remember waking up with a startle at the sound of his voice, not knowing what the deal was, but hearing enough fear in his cry of, "You better come see this," to know that something was definitely wrong. I pulled my shorts and boots on, then joined the other two guys in rushing through the woods in the direction of Mike's voice. But then, as soon as he came into view, he turned to us and started shouting, "No, no, no, don't run," with this look of absolute terror on his face. We all freeze, thinking he might be facing down a black bear or something, but the whole woods in front of him was completely clear. That's when he points down into the ground in front of him, saying something like, This wasn't here yesterday, was it? He was pointing at another rusty old bear trap. And no, it was most definitely not there the day before. It was lying right where we'd all been walking to and from the little bathroom area we designated, right out in the open too. And we all agreed that whoever had put it there was banking on one of us stepping on it during a nocturnal bathroom break. We had to repeat the process of being extremely careful where we stood as we trudged back towards our campground and packed our stuff. We applied the same amount of care to where we stepped when making our way south away from Barber's Creek and towards a small town called Newcastle. We were in no mood to stay out on the trail, not after it had become painfully obvious that whoever had laid the bear trap had followed us all the way from Lignite down to Barber's Creek. It was also a deeply unsettling realization that the bear trap we found at Lignite probably wasn't there by accident either. Like I said, given its condition, we figured it had been set years before our arrival, when by then it seemed much more likely that it had been set as we slept. Once we got to Newcastle, I made sure to call our find into the local cops, as just about anyone could have accidentally walked out onto that bear trap.
Step 2.
And God forbid if they were alone and lacking cell reception. But then, the question about who might have placed the traps came up, and neither us nor the cops had any clue who might have actually done something like that. In fact, they found it pretty weird that someone wouldn't cover the thing up with leaves or make any other kind of attempt to hide it. It was like whoever had laid it there wanted us to find it. Like it was more about sending a message than actually trying to maim one of us. We ended up catching a bus over to Parisburg to completely throw whoever it was off our trail. And there was a period where Mike didn't want us to carry on at all. He was that freaked out by the idea of someone following us, totally unseen. Not only that, but they were able to somehow lay a bear trap without making any noise, which we all found intensely creepy all on its own, especially at night. Thankfully, no one followed us for the rest of the trip, not to our knowledge anyway, and there were no more bear trap finds near any of the other campsites. That didn't mean that we didn't have some seriously sleepless nights for a few days. And the first night we got back out on the trail, we all spent it sitting around a dead fire, shining our flashlights out into the darkness, just scanning the woods for any signs of anyone creeping around. It was only when we were 100% sure that we weren't in any more real danger that we were able to get any decent sleep.
I know what I'm
But I think by
doing.
that point, whoever had been laying the traps was confident that we'd gotten the message to leave and to never come trespassing around Lignite again.
Set sail.
An ally has been slain.
I've been hiking the Appalachian Trail for the better part of 30 years now, and I've had plenty of hair-raising run-ins that I don't care to repeat. I've come face to face with black bears and their cubs, which, as any experienced person will tell you, is about as close to staring death in the face as a hiker can get. I've had fishers running up trees next to my tent at night, which was very unsettling back when I was at an age when stories of skinwalkers still raised the hairs on the back of my neck. And there was one time that I heard such a sickening crack of wood when crossing a log bridge over a stretch of rushing river that I was just about convinced that I was going to drown. But let me tell you, there ain't no kind of fear like the fear your fellow man can give you. And the Appalachians have a way of getting into people's heads in a way that can be just as negative as it can be positive. I can tell you firsthand, once you get a taste for hiking, you really enjoy it. There's nothing quite like being up there, far away from civilization, relying on nothing but your wits and whatever you can carry on your back. The Appalachians change people. Like you might have heard about the old tradition of taking a trail name, something like Bear or Sovereign or some other kind of nickname, as a way of expressing how you've left your old self back down in the lowlands, having ascended to a higher plane. both figuratively and literally.
Aced.
It's not just for aesthetic purposes either, folks, because every time you go out into the wilderness, a little bit of the wilderness goes into you too. For some folks, mainly city folks, that can be a good thing. It opens the mind, helps them better appreciate the simple things, like a warm, soft bed or a good shower. But for other folks, the Appalachians get into them in a way that a demon might possess someone's soul. It burns them up inside, burns everything good out of them, until all that's left ain't fit to be called human. I've heard stories of people taking their own lives after hikes, when they've walked the whole trail over the course of a summer or fall, then just been unable to go back to their drab, tedious lives back in their concrete jungle.
Don't get cocky.
I've heard plenty of other stories of folks who lose their minds up in those hills before running into a group of less experienced hikers and just killing them. I've never encountered anyone like that myself, but I believe I almost did. And that's about as far as I ever want to get to one of them. This was way back in the late 90s when I was doing some solo hiking in the Great Smoky. I was experienced enough not to have to stick to the trails as such, but not experienced enough to know that it's better to wait out approaching bad weather than to try and beat the sky. I thought taking a more direct route over the hills and through the forest would mean I could get a hot shower and hot chow quicker. But as it turned out, my arrogance meant I was caught in a hellish downpour. Experienced hikers will tell you that a hot sun might burn and blister your skin, but wet feet can kill you. Wet feet means foot rot and fungus, and when you're relying on them to get to food and shelter and away from any potential dangers, not being able to rely on your feet can be a death sentence. I knew enough to know that, so when the heavens suddenly opened, I went running off to find myself some cover. In the end, I found it, and it came in the form of what I thought was a shallow cave set into a rock face. At the time, I thought it was an actual godsend, and I said a little prayer of thanks as I took off my wet clothes and swapped them for dry ones. I was so relieved to be out of the rain that I didn't actually check out how deep the cave went. Not until I was dry again and getting bored from having to take shelter for so long. I took my flashlight out from my pack, switched it on, and then saw that the cave went way further back than the creeping daylight led to believe. Not only that, but it narrowed off into a much smaller passageway that I'd have to get on my hands and knees to traverse. Now I know what you're thinking. Who in their right mind would want to crawl down a narrow cave tunnel in the middle of the woods when I could just stay warm and dry and safe in the cave's opening while I waited for the rainstorm to pass? But then I imagine there's some of you that have gathered that I have something of an adventurous streak, and that after about an hour of just sitting there, waiting for the rain to pass, I was just about going crazy with boredom. So if there was something that could help me kill some time before I get back on the move again, you bet your butt that I was going to do it. That's how I ended up creeping towards the opening